Well, joining us now is the principal of South College, Durham University, and former BBC executive, Professor Tim Luckhurst. Good morning, Tim. First of all, just your broad thoughts, really, on this situation and how complicated it is for the BBC to handle now.
From the very beginning, this entire scandal has been marked by an appalling absence of accurate factual information. There have always been more questions than answers, and those questions do focus very much at the moment on the Sun, not on the BBC. But it is a difficult day for the BBC, not least, as you say, because Tim, the Director General, is publishing the BBC's annual report, and he's going to face a lot of questions which perhaps a few months ago he wouldn't have been expecting to face today. So he will come under a great deal of pressure. I think the BBC on the whole has handled this well, but its position is made much more complex by the current nature of privacy law in the UK.
Is there a question, though, Tim, whether if we believe the family, the parents of this young person, they said they had an hour-long conversation with somebody in the BBC, we don't know how senior they were, in May for an hour, and nothing happened. Was there a failure? If that is a correct representation, should it not have been escalated right then?
Well, as you say, if that is the correct representation, and there's absolutely no certainty that that is the correct representation, it seems that the parents approached the BBC in May. It seems that there was a conversation in which they asked the BBC to prevent the unnamed presenter from doing certain things. If that is the case, as a BBC executive, my first response would have been to say, look, I need to know an awful lot more. I can't simply intervene as you're asking me to, without evidence that the allegations you are making are substantiated. And I think that would have been a reasonable approach from the BBC. If that is the approach they took, and they didn't get the answers they needed, then I entirely understand why the BBC has been extremely cautious about this. They have competing obligations. They have an obligation to their employee. They have an obligation to a vulnerable young person who may have been the subject of criminal behaviour. But those competing obligations both need to be dealt with very carefully, and I think the BBC has tried very hard to deal with them carefully.
The presenter in question this morning is obviously in a very, very difficult position, Tim. Andrew and I, we were sitting here saying, it could happen to anybody in the public eye, actually. If it is a false allegation, then we are all vulnerable to false allegations. And that's where I have some sympathy with the BBC and how they handle this, because they must have allegations, you would think, on a fairly regular basis about all sorts of people in the public eye. But now that the police have said at the moment there is no burden of proof to arrest anybody, and the alleged victim of this crime has effectively come out and said that I am not a victim, there is no crime here, where does this leave the allegedly accused presenter?
Well, the presenter could choose to identify themselves, but the presenter has chosen not to do that. At the moment, our privacy law is pretty restrictive, and we obviously have to abide by the law. My own view is that privacy law has gone too far since the Leveson inquiry. There was a time when people accused of such offences were identified before they were charged, or even though charges might subsequently be emerging, and were given an opportunity to defend themselves in public as well as facing accusations in public. That is a much harder position to achieve now. On the whole, we take the view that if there is any possibility of criminal proceedings in the future, we do not name the accused until such time as charges are brought, and we're a very long point away from that stage. So it's difficult because privacy law makes it difficult, and I have enormous sympathy for the BBC. I have enormous sympathy also for the Sun. I'm one of those strange things, a genuine liberal. I actually think we need our great national broadcaster. I also think we need great popular newspapers. So that's an unusual position perhaps, but I genuinely believe it. I think in a liberal, plural and diverse media environment, both are enormously valuable.
You talk about the privacy law, Tim. If I could press you, do you think it would be appropriate, bearing in mind we're now on day 4 or even 5 of this story, lots of people watching this programme, listening to this programme, will probably have a fairly good idea who it is. My own newspaper today, the Daily Mail, says on the front page, a poll shows 1 in 6 people already know. Would it just be easier if the person's name was released and then they could defend themselves if they are insisting they've done nothing wrong, and it would be much easier for everybody? including the presenter.
It wouldn't be easier for the BBC or indeed for the Sun, because they might then face extremely expensive actions for defamation. So I don't think it would be easy at all, because of the way that privacy law operates. The only way that that name is going to enter the public domain at the moment, and I hope it does not, in fact, the only way it will happen is if a member of Parliament decides to name the presenter under parliamentary privilege. Now, the Daily Mail suggests that that might be under consideration, that some MPs might choose to do that. That, of course, is something that MPs operating under parliamentary privilege could do. Whether it would be appropriate to do so is a matter for their consciences.
Under what circumstances could you imagine they would be driven to say such a thing, Tim?
Under what circumstances might the parents be driven to say such a thing?
No, I'm sorry. Under what circumstances would an MP think they had a right to name this person publicly?
Well,
what could their motivation possibly be?
Well, their motivation could be that they think that privacy law has gone too far, that privacy law has been driven by judges making decisions, not by parliamentary scrutiny and not by the decisions of our elected representatives. And I'd have a degree of sympathy for that position. After all, MPs are supposed to make laws, not simply to be subject to laws which have been implemented by court decision. And there are people in Parliament who think that that's a very inappropriate use of our constitutional procedures. That would be a principled position, and it's one for which I'd have some sympathy. But I think it would cause enormous difficulties for both the Sun and the BBC.
There's an irony here, Tim, isn't there, that we are where we are with this privacy law because of the previous actions of the dear old BBC when police raided the Cliff Richard's home. He's, of course, a national treasure. You don't need me to tell you that. Not only were the BBC tipped off and covered the event, they flew a flipping helicopter above Cliff's home to film the entire thing, ran on TV and radio. Not a shred of evidence was ever put against Cliff Richard, was never even questioned by the police. And as a result of that, he won a case against the BBC, and we now have the privacy law we've got today.
Well, that was the start of the move towards the privacy law that we've got today. You're absolutely right, Andrew. Of course, there was also a case last year involving Bloomberg and an accusation in which they wished to name the accused, and the courts again prevented them from doing so until charges were brought. So this has gone on, not just one case, but you're absolutely right, the Cliff Richard case, and that was a colossal error of judgment, was the beginning of it. And I understand why people think privacy law has gone too far. But I'm also someone who believes that whilst one can protest against the current law, one should abide by it until such time as Parliament changes it.
I'll ask you one last question, Tim. Does the BBC have to behave differently to commercial broadcasters in the sense it's a public service broadcaster, it's paid for entirely out of mainly out of people's pockets through the licence fee? Do they have a more finessed duty of care?
I think that they are held to a higher standard of accountability, and I think that every Director General, every BBC journalist knows that the BBC deserves to be held to a higher standard of accountability. Given the way that the BBC is funded, given that it is a great tool of British cultural diplomacy, respected at home and abroad, I think it's appropriate that the BBC should be scrutinised in that way. I think it's the price that the BBC pays for a licence fee settlement which enables it to have great scope, great reach and great international influence. So, yeah, the BBC is held to a very high standard of accountability. It should be held to a very high standard of accountability. I think every Director General since Lord Reith has known that that's the case, and Tim Davie is certainly going to know it's the case today, and that's perfectly appropriate.
Thank you, Professor Tim Luckhurst there, and we will bring you that interrogation of Tim Davie, let's call it that, later this morning.